I'm Ken George from the Department of Anthropology, and it's a real pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Mathangi Krishnamurthy, who is our Andrew Mellon Postdoctoral Fellow at the Institute for Research in the Humanities and also the Postdoctoral Fellow in our Department of Anthropology. Mathangi, along with John Nimis and is Lee Friedrich here, represent our first wave of Mellon Postdoctoral Fellows to the university, and we're just so lucky to have the three of you, and we're just so lucky to have you here because you just bring things to the department, to the center, and to the Center for South Asian Studies as well. For those of you who haven't yet been acquainted with Dr. Krishnamurthy, she took her PhD just last summer at the Department of Anthropology at the University of Texas, Austin. She took a master's on the way there as well. But prior to that, she took a master's in communication at the Mudra Institute of Communication in Ahmedabad, and before that, a Bachelor of Commerce at the University of Pune in India, which is also the site, not the university, but Pune is the city in which you did your doctoral fieldwork on call centers. The work that's being done on flexible labor, be it in the context of call centers or other corporate entities, is an issue of increasing interest to us in anthropology, as I'm sure it is for those of you and those of us working in South Asian studies. And I know Mathangi is keenly at work on turning her dissertation, 1-800-Worlds, Embodiment and Experience in the Indian Call Center Economy, into a book. And so we're getting a first glimpse of perhaps one of the chapters in that book. It's going to be on waking life and working life, sleeplessness, or sleep economies in these call centers. So please join me in welcoming Mathangi Krishnamurthy.
Thank you all for being here. I'm delighted to be here on a nice sunny wintry afternoon. I was counting on winter stupor and inattention, but doesn't look like that's possible. Thank you, Ken, for that wonderful introduction, and I'm a little intimidated at having to sort of round off what has been a wonderful semester of talks, and I thank Rachel for having invited me to be part of this opportunity. I'm going to talk today, as I've talked incessantly over the last 6 or 7 years or so, about call centers. And over the years, I've sort of noticed how the fetish value of my project has been leaking, and people are no longer very surprised when I talk about call centers and about young Indian workers who come out at night to speak to people in the US and the UK about customer service, about things as exciting as failed computer connections or missed airlines or insurance or what have you. So today I'm going to talk about how increasingly the work of call centers has become normalized. How is it that it has become routinized and people are no longer surprised? I have a couple of pictures which are always fun. I do my work in Pune, which is about there, south of Bombay. And Pune, according to the current census, is a city of about 5.5 million, give or take a few million. And since we do not have a current census exactly on how many of these are call center workers or a record of how many young people are employed, I'd counted at anywhere between 50 to 100,000. Young people between the ages of 18 and 25. This is what Pune looks like. And call centers are located mainly around the ends of town. So around here, and here, and some here. So you can see they're all on the outskirts, and they need large swaths of land to build campuses and infrastructures that can hold large corporations. This is also the city. This is the inner part of Pune, for those of you who are familiar and might have done work here. This is Jangli Maharaj Road, also Common Youth Hangout. This is one of the business districts of this city, Kalyani Nagar. And this is one of the residential areas. So around Pune, and this is when I did my work, it was between 2004 to 2007 or so is when I was in field. And you would see all around the city posters such as these, which says BPO jobs, or business process outsourcing jobs, which are shorthand for call center work. It says freshers welcome. That doesn't mean anything any more nefarious than people who haven't had first-time jobs. Ideally, people ought to know English. to be able to do these jobs. And in most cases, young college students who were in Pune and following undergraduate careers did have work conversant in English. Or they could go to places such as these that gave them a 1 or 2 week boot camp in how to learn English and how to perform in an interview in order to get through a call center job. If you go through these, you can go and drop in a little form at booths such as these that used to be stationed around colleges. And then you can go and you fill a form and you get employed immediately. Ideally, you should look as cool as that. So you can be picked up in cabs such as these that ply in the nights. All these photographs are in the day, but remember all of this work is happening at night, to go to places like this, or this, or perhaps even this. So my talk, as Ken mentioned, is a chapter from a much larger project called 1-800-Worlds. And I'm very concerned with this idea of what might be called a call center world, how it's enacted, its rituals, its habits, its routines, its every nights, not every days. I have to check myself every time I say every day. And in some ways, I'm concerned with the question of worlding itself. And yes, I'm an anthropologist, but I haven't made up that word. Worlding is something that I borrow from the work of Kathleen Stewart, who I'm very inspired by, this question of how small worlds persist within the worlds that we live in today. In this paper, I'm concerned with one of the very rudimentary learnings of call center life, namely, how is it that one manages to stay awake at night, the management of sleeplessness. In other words, I'm also interested in sleep or sleeplessness as the experience of the night. And of course, I'm aware that such management is neither heroic nor individual, but more as a regime of practices. And in this paper, I want to trace how is it that the call center creates subjects that can manage such sleeplessness. As I mentioned, businesses that travel to India in order to outsource customer service work are not very new. This has been happening since about 2000, when they began to move to urban centers in order to work through nightly organizations that function from about 7 in the evening to about 6 or 7 in the morning to serve the day of the US or the UK. So young people, mainly between the ages of 18 and 25, were taught how to speak in American accents, were asked to come to work in the night, and transportation was provided in order that you could have this cachet of labor that could provide regular 24/7 customer service. Now, as part of this field work, I interviewed a number of workers, but I also spent about 4 months working in a call center, training people how to speak in an American accent, go figure. And so some of this paper, a lot of it, would also draw upon autoethnography, on things that I learned while I was in the call center. Because by the time I got on field, there was increasingly a large amount of secrecy around activities that had nothing to do with data management, merely just the nightly life of call centers. One of the ways in which I'm looking at call centers as signifying something is in a certain state of physicality that I speak to today. So in this state of physicality, it involves a practice of instantly sort of disintering the awake self from the asleep self, no matter the time of evening or night, and conversely coaxing the body into sleep, irrespective of the break of dawn or day. For 4 months, I sort of inhabited such a form of unsleep. Unsure of span, uncertain of calm, now awake, now asleep, now comatose, I meandered between extreme states of alertness in the nights, staying awake through coffee, exercise, and work, and wakeful sleep in the day, combating light, noise, and the day dwellers with heavy curtains and the blinkers I had stored from airplanes and hotel rooms. For 4 months, I was called to be awake on demand, changing my sleep schedules week after week. For 4 months, I dreamt of sleep. It might be argued that I was one of the inflexible ones, unable to realize that staying awake in the night is merely, and I quote, a mind game, as Preeti, one of my respondents, put it. She said, just train your body to work differently, because after all, don't farmers wake up before sunrise? And so many people work night shifts anyway, in the factory, truck drivers, doctors. Preeti was 21 during the time of this interview and had moved to the city from Bombay in order to be independent of her family. Her examples were relevant, her attitude exemplary. Preeti had truly learned how to be a good call center worker. But just like the other night shift workers she referenced, it came with its attendant costs. Her ability to be a good worker was won not only by fighting against the body, but also against parental norms, societal judgment, and daily life. 6 months after this conversation, Preeti quit her job at the call center due to acute health issues that mandated a 6-month leave from work. She narrated this problem of health as having necessitated her taking time off on doctor's orders, and wondered aloud as to how it would affect her prospects for upward mobility should she return to the company after the sabbatical. One of the first questions that's asked of applicants when they come to the call center interview is, are you prepared to work at night? It's almost a given. It's ubiquitous. You enter and you know this is how the interview is going to run. A 22-year-old woman called Shilpa told me that she had declared her complete willingness to do so without informing her parents who she lived with, because if she hadn't, she wouldn't have been considered at all. Many workers negotiated with their parents after the fact of being given a job offer and given an actual salary offer so that they could talk about financial independence, lest they be even denied this opportunity. Now, one of the earliest studies of the biological and social effects of nightly work was commissioned by the International Labour Office and was titled Night Work: Its Effects on the Health and Welfare of the Worker. It defined night work either as part of a continuous work schedule, such as in process industries that run 24/7, or exclusive, as in the case of professions such as night watchmen. It also acknowledged that it was difficult to separate night work's biological effects from its social impact, concluding, and I quote, "Every industrial society generates and must then settle a conflict between its functions of production and of the protection of the producer, between the demands of industrial growth and the quality of individual and social life," unquote. Call center work paradoxically conformed to both kinds of shift work. So it works 24/7 because organizations that outsource to India need customer service to be available round the clock, but at the same time, it's mainly performed at night in India in order to serve the day of the US or the UK. I argue that call centers responded to this tension that the report indexes by creating a nightly world that not only defined a workspace, but also extended it into a parallel sociality. While interviewing workers, managers were categorical about the necessity of functioning in the night and waking up, as one manager put it, like your satellite television, on demand. The corporation assisted in the work of transnationality by presenting the night and its awake state as not only safe and hospitable, but also as a necessary condition for upward mobility. The corporation tried to ensure that the night was a self-sufficient, coherent world. Managers, team leaders cautioned workers about the perils of losing sleep and eating badly. Offices ran full-fledged cafeterias with a choice of meal plans. Gymnasiums were available working through the night. Coffee machines were always running. More importantly, cabs ran back and forth, picking employees to ensure that they came to work. And the cabs were a complete world unto their own. So when I was working at the call center, every night you would have a different cab on the roster. So they would call you about an hour before they're required to pick you up, which is an hour before you actually start work. So you get a call from a different cab driver every night asking for directions to your place, because all they get is a roster that indicates your phone number. So then you go through elaborate directions, because of course signposts are not very visible in the night. There is no GPS that will give you a clear idea of how Pune is laid out. And if you enter the inner part of the city, you're doomed. So in so many ways, every night you're doing this thing. Rote learning every night in Marathi. I'd say, take a left from Sarja Hotel, wait for this, you'll see a neon light by the bank, stop there. And stop 5 paces close to the gate, because I don't want to wait in the dark. So every night you do this, and then the cab would come by. This unique form of navigation was not only inefficient, but also led to large numbers of hours of wastage of work, which required that you be picked up at least 2 hours before you actually got to work. Grabbing a few more precious moments of sleep, I would pull myself up right after this conversation, stumble to the light switch, and will naked, harsh, fluorescent night light and wakefulness into my sleep-deprived body. Making my way to the store, I would put on a pot of coffee, call a friend, hoping that he might get to work at the same time. We could catch up over second coffees on the terrace of the office building. I would pick up my bag, lock the gate, and scuttle down the corridor of the building, hoping that I don't wake up the neighbors who might complain and talk about how the society should not let in people who are working in call centers to rent. I would grab a water bottle, which is essential because nightly hydration is something that workers often forget, and this leads to throat problems all the time. So you're required to drink water through the night in order to keep on calls. I would tiptoe past the snoring watchmen and open the rusty gates. And standing at the corner of an eerily quiet road, I would fend off barking dogs and wait for the white Tata Indica cab and its headlights to direct the driver to the end of the street. The other occupants would often be asleep. Once within the company premises, one might think it just another day. If you notice, that's 2:31. The building would be brightly lit and people would be in and out at all times of night. Reminiscent of Baudrillard's what he calls aseptic whiteness, workers seem to be forever exposed to light through technology and its glare. The company gymnasium remained open, as I mentioned, but additionally many organizations also provided incentives by way of allowing for 24-hour dives to open up around the organization so that people get food and drink before and after. When I mean food and drink, I mean food and alcohol. Trainers moved in and out of classes, cabs expelled their sleepy contents, agents milled around the tiny deli counter before leaving for their work and training sessions. While agents monitored calls, team leaders supervised performance, and trainers led another batch of new workers through voice, accent, and process lessons. New workers were also required to start working through the night because they could then be acclimatized to the work schedules. When I asked Hemant, a call center veteran of over 5 years, about the problems of nocturnal work, he exasperatedly said, "What's the big deal? After all, the game must go on." I sort of interrupt such a game to emphasize the philosophy of what is called the going concern, the multinational corporation, and in turn globalization, a game that continues day and night with no regard for what might be called normal human schedules. The organization overcame time by traversing space, and Hemant was part of this effort. Now, besides providing transportation for workers, organizations also ensured a strong communications network as a corridor to the workspace. So it was not only physical, it was also ensured by communication networks such as cell phones. So all workers necessarily had to have a working cell phone that, of course, was provided by having cell phone companies also on campus that gave them incentives and subsidies. And if you didn't have a cell phone, you were literally stranded on this landscape. The connection carried into the day. I rarely ever interviewed a worker without them being interrupted by at least 6 phone calls, not only for work, but also for socializing about where they're going to meet, who they're going to meet, which pub they're going to hang out in before or after work. Now, this is generally the time of night when we would be waking up and coming back, which meant you come back to sleep right when the sun is about rising. The sales pitch, the amenities, the rules, and indeed the very understanding of the night as not only constitutive but also possible, rendered night work at once banal and special. Here I want to suggest that the institutional, emotional, and procedural contents of call center work rendered the night itself into what Ben Anderson has called an affective atmosphere that fed into the idea of a call center world. The nightly travels, and the community of other workers in the call center together created intensities as a kind of atmosphere that envelopes life. And I quote, "Intensities that are only imperfectly housed in the name we give to emotions." The night is not only a discursive but also an aesthetic object and a sensual experience, was then apprehended precisely through such an atmosphere and becomes an important element of work routine. Therefore, this nightly secret public of call center workers was not only cohered by the fact of work and the act of staying awake, but by the aesthetic atmosphere of night. Its travails, roots, darknesses, alleys, neon lights, absences, and presences became part of the ways in which the worker was attached to work and to the workplace. And in so many ways, no matter the banality of work and the sleeplessness of routine, this is what sort of bound the community together and created a social world. Now, the other thing that bound them together was the management of sleep. The skill of not only managing waking times, but also surviving on sleeplessness helped move call center life. In many accounts, sleep became a casualty of work, and sleeplessness a mark of valor. I quote, "I slept 4 hours only," or "I didn't sleep at all," were casual comments I heard many a time during the course of my interviews. I want to sort of run through 2 or 3 different interviews that I had with people to talk about how is it that people were oriented to the very idea of sleeping or not sleeping. I'm going to talk about a respondent I call Ashwin. The names are, of course, pseudonyms. And this is an interview I conducted with Ashwin in my apartment. "But why?" I asked Ashwin. "Why are you ruining your health like this?" Eyes bloodshot, clothes rumpled, hair dusty and unwashed, Ashwin had been lolling on my daybed rolling a joint. "Maza aata hai. It's fun," he said. "It's great. I get on my bike, the roads are all empty, I go to work, and I can stay as long as I want. Koi puchne wala nahi. Nobody can nag me. Ashwin was a few months short of his 21st birthday and was often the subject of playful ribbing by his friends for not being able to walk into a pub and buy alcohol. However, he had all the other trappings of adulthood. He earned between Indian rupees 15,000 and 25,000 a month, and had once, he claimed, taken home 57,000 in 5 days because he had worked 5 days without a stretch, 5 days and 5 nights. At the time of a conversation, he was juggling 2 different relationships and would keep glancing at his cell phone to screen calls. He said, "So when do you meet your girlfriend?" I asked. He said, "Well, one's at the office and the other's in Delhi. It's all set." So I shook my head and smiled and persisted in my line of questioning and asked him why he liked working at night. I quote, Ashwin said, "Fark nahi padta. It doesn't matter. It's all work. My father used to be in the army and then he came back to start a travel agency. I used to go to my dad's office every day and eat and come back. And one day one of his friends told him, when they were having a few drinks, 'Why don't you make your son work?' So he forcibly took me to a call center interview saying, 'You'll know what life is. Go and find out how to work.' I got selected and I hated work. I used to run away all the time. My team leader would come home and drag me to work again. My dad used to drop me to office every day. I used to cry. My dad told me to stop finally because he got tired of all this, but then I said no. I started liking the job. First, I only knew how to check my email. Then I started liking operating systems and computers and all that. I used to stay for 18 to 20 hours taking calls. I was 17. I used to feel good." Unquote. To Ashwin, as he grew to like work over time, the necessity of long hours and the necessity of depriving himself of sleep became a mere occupational condition. It did not matter that he was working at night. It was necessary to work in order to know the world. The content of his job, the recognition it accorded him, which were otherwise denied to him by his father, were also instrumental in creating and rendering the workplace and its conditions attractive. When I asked him how he managed his sleep, he said, "I used to get drunk and go to office all the time. Every alternate day, I used to get drunk, go to the office, take calls. I'd sleep at my manager's place because it was closer to work. People at home used to tell me not to work for so long, but my manager would say, 'Just come and sleep at my place and then go to work.' And this was only for 7,000 rupees. When you're working very hard, it doesn't matter. The money doesn't matter. I used to sleep for 2 hours, wake up, have a smoke, take calls, go to sleep again. One week, I took 190 calls. I used to have underwear, t-shirts in my manager's locker. After those 5 straight days of work, I slept for 32 hours." Unquote. Ashwin's relationship to the night was partly managed by reducing the amount of sleep he substituted on, and partly by cooperative managers who helped ensure that he could get to work on time, or even better, did not have to leave the workplace at all. Many young workers that I interviewed similarly took pride in being able to manage on very little sleep and stay long hours at work. Conversations often revolved around competition over the number of hours that one managed to subsist on, and male respondents often led me through their routines of sleep and eating that included cigarettes, Red Bull, and marijuana, specifying that it did take a lot of effort to be able to maintain a call center lifestyle. However, they also peppered their awareness of this effort with a matter-of-factness. Styling themselves as the new flexible citizens of a global age, many respondents shared their macho nonchalance with a shrug of the shoulders and a smirk, indicating their amusement at my obsession with the question of the night. Such flexibility was not without direction, given that it was employed in the service of work. Call center work, while in itself but a stopover for many workers who promptly left after about 6 or 8 months, was nevertheless something that allowed them to become flexible and to incorporate flexibility into the routines of their lives. Ashwin narrated how his father would call him every month, mock his salary of rupees 24,000, saying that it took his father merely an hour to make that much money. When I asked him how he reacted to this, he said, "Well, I tell him fine, but I work, I like it. I don't go to an office and sit there and make people work for me." The shifts to Ashwin were part of the contractual obligation to work. Work to him was part of a rite of passage, one initiated by his father, and now in turn played out in defiance and stubbornness. Sleeplessness merely formed part of this complex of both rebellion and adulthood. Work was not just the task at hand, but also the ability to last through the shift, to stay beyond the time of duty, and to push the limits of physical and mental endurance. To work meant to be permanently in a daze, to not know how time progressed or the way the hour chased the one preceding it until it all melted into one long night and a fitfully sleepy day. Days became months, years, life stayed tightly bound within the movements of the call center. Sleep disorders would ensue, the stomach would rebel, but workers were young and believed in being able to endure. The body for them would not be a reason for abandoning work. A litany of maladies might build up like a roster of war wounds, but to work was to test knowledge of self. To such workers, being in the call center was tantamount to both rebellion and attaining adulthood/manhood. For those who stayed longer in the industry, night work and sleep had necessarily to be normalized. Simran, a 27-year-old woman whose husband also held a call center job, spoke of the ubiquity of night shift work and said, "It's not like I didn't have an idea of night shifts or something. My dad used to do it. My husband used to do it. So definitely I knew what a night shift was. How to change your body cycle. You have to actually think that evening when you wake up, that's your morning. You cannot think that it's 6 o'clock in the evening now. Not like that. This kind of body cycle I was able to adjust by thinking like this. You wake up, just put it in your brain that it's morning. Don't look outside. Don't look at the light or lack of it. I was able to manage, and that was my main concern." Here Simran sort of drew upon earlier memories of night shifts in factory work and industrialized work and normalized it according to her understanding of herself as a modern woman who could inhabit a man's world. Drawing upon existing and pragmatic knowledge of bureaucratizing such inversion, she resorted to mapping the change required of her schedules onto a malleable, governed, disciplined body. Many of my colleagues shared her view that it was a matter of willing oneself to invert common wisdom and think of the night as day. If one could do away with this orthodox separation, they all claimed that's all that is required. Ajaya, a human resources manager, often required to work long hours, shared her views on being a working mother. Of course, as I mentioned, it's all about time management, she said, and how the person takes it. So what if I have to work night shifts? I have to give the evening time to my child, so it's about working 9 hours in the whole 24 hours. You merely adjust. You don't have to give separate time or extra time, you manage your time. Both these women that I spoke to clearly worked within a very routinized meaning of flexibility. So clearly it was not this question of this macho rebellion that Ashwin was talking about. But to them, it was also this idea of being someone who could function as well as the men who worked in the call center world. So it's also this question of what is an equalized playing field for them. Many scholars, Linda McDowell, Mary Beth Mills, for example, point to the study of masculinity as essential to understanding gender dynamics in the context of work. The manager, in many cases, is always an authority-laden masculine figure, and this masculine aspect must necessarily be adopted by women wishing to break through the gender ceiling. Organizational logics make a naturalized connection between responsibility, job complexity, and hierarchical position within the environment of the corporation. Hence, child rearing, emotional responsibilities, and various other commitments outside the workplace are not taken into consideration in the evaluation of employee performance. For example, reviews purport an ostensible equality between men and women, requiring that both exhibit equal commitment to the organization. So the closest that the sort of disembodied, abstract, perfect worker comes to is the male worker. And I quote from Aker, whose life centers on his full-time, long-life job, while his wife or another woman takes care of his personal needs and his children. So this kind of disembodiment that the women themselves bought into was just sort of a double sleight of hand. It privileged men, it erased the space outside the corporation, pretty much in the same stroke. And the individual was successfully abstracted from the body that, in my account, is so very central to call center work. Across the stories of men and women, one could identify a tendency towards a kind of implicitly masculine objectivity in the service of a nightly routine. There was a partial will, or at the least, an intent to refuse the abnormality of night work or the lack of sleep. Whether as a masculine rite of passage, an act of rebellion, or as pragmatics of corporate mobility, workers attempted to render possible the inversion of night and day. So one would think that this newspaper coverage of this kind of ill effects of night work are all highly banal, that people get used to it. People do what they have to do. And you hear this all the time. The globalization's critics are all overreaching, are talking about this in this overdetermined manner. However, I argue that banality itself is a performance that needs to be analyzed as an effect of globalization and its demands. Such demands for being banal do not account for the different positions that workers occupy by way of age, class, gender, and how these differences affect the very specific navigation of nightly work and sleeplessness. The only thing that banality accounts for is the constitutive condition of work in this case, being asleep and awake on demand. And so in so many ways, the politics of sleep or lack thereof were a strong structuring force in the call center milieu. And here I use a lot of the work of a scholar called Matthew Wolf-Meyer, who works out of Santa Cruz, and talks about somnopolitics. How is it that globalization capitalizes on sleep habits? And he calls somnopolitics those beliefs or practices that structure sleep in contemporary American society, and I would argue global society or transnational society. In this venture, I'm very interested in somnopolitics as reincorporating the ability to look at sleep and the body as modular, as things that you can train yourself to work through in every case, so the body becomes not the totality but the sum of its parts and the habits that it incorporates. Sleep in the call center was simultaneously dismissed and ordered. In response, many workers functioned with a fatalistic notion of chronic sleeplessness or sleep deprivation. Varun, one of my respondents, said, "Show me a person with bags under his eyes and I'll show you a call center worker." He claimed to have been functioning on 4 hours sleep per night during the week that I interviewed him. I asked him how he managed. He said, "The body goes for a toss. I sometimes don't know how I get home from work or how I go to sleep or when I wake up. I don't even look at a clock anymore." Sleep, while essential to normal functioning, was subsumed by the demands of work and livelihood. Through a variety of tactics meant to heighten and prolong the experience of being awake, call center workers accumulated what has been called a sleep debt, an awareness that sleep in society could be or must be mutually managed to produce the most beneficial or efficient ordering of society and the bodies that comprised it. While such awareness was no doubt essential to workers' ability to invert daily routines into nightly ones, it came up against the stubbornness of bodily demands. Workers sought to manage the situation by what Wolf-Meyer has called pharmacological subjects, consuming stimulants and alertness enhancers to prolong the waking state. I argue that the call center perpetuated and encouraged a flexible understanding of sleep, an understanding that was nevertheless incomplete, difficult, and very, very hard to follow through, and which showed up in bags under the eyes, sleeplessness, dissatisfaction, and never enough flexibility. In concluding, I sort of want to lead into what I think I'm working through to look at why is it that call centers do the things that they do. They know what they're doing, but they do it. To paraphrase it, I am arguing that working in a call center leads to certain forms of attachment. These are forms of attaching to work, to co-workers, to the milieu, and to money. They bring you closer, in the words of Laurent Belland, to the satisfying something that you cannot generate on your own, but sense in the wake of a person, a way of life, an object, project, concept, or scene. Belland argues that such optimism, this idea that something is going to come if you just keep at it, invites a return to the mise en scène of fantasy, in the hope that this time, now that a new set of elements is in place, the objective will be achieved, the truth will come forth, and that which you deserve will make itself manifest. A good life, so to speak. Now, fantasy in her analysis is a repository of ideal futures, how people add up to something, and she's of course interested in what happens when those fantasies begin to fray. And fray they will, fray they have, and I talk about these elsewhere, but I sort of locate this paper a little adjacent to and a little before that question. In this paper, I'm interested in how such optimism is produced and how is it that you follow through with it night after night. And I view flexibility as one of the techniques of such management, and the call center as one of the sites that both inspires and coheres such technique. The details of call center lives to me hint at much larger changes in urban India. The call center, though a site, signifies a shorthand, a network, and an assemblage of a larger set of practices, habits, spatial and temporal changes. In this project, the call center is a symptom of the ongoing effort to render life normal in the face of constant change. Knowledges, regimes, discourses, and everyday life together conspire to increasingly make it ordinary. People, in these case workers, find themselves compelled to expend effort constantly in spite of nightly schedules towards normality and possibility, and it is this effort that I term flexibility. Flexibility, very clearly, to me in my analysis, is very, very strongly a mode of power and in this case, a constitutive condition of the new Indian service economy. I will stop there and look forward to you. I'm happy to take questions.
Mathangi, we'll just let you.
Please. This guy.
Thank you. I really enjoyed that paper, and towards the end, you started talking about the modularity of the body. I thought that was a really great thing to think with. But it took me back to when you were talking about the gendered nature of this.
Sure.
The male coming of age and the women sort of trying to train their bodies to behave in the ways that their fathers did on night shifts. So there was a couple of questions. One was, this sort of called me up to another kind of device to think with, which is this idea of the cyborg, the way in which just sort of gender splits are actually difficult to locate. So along those lines, I was wondering if you could comment a little bit more about the way in which the technologies of call centers, aside from taxi cabs and cell phones,
Sure.
the way in which the technologies of the call centers induce this kind of practice and this kind of flexibility, which is both sort of repressive and also empowering, which I think also gets this sort of ambiguous notion of the cyborg.
Yeah, absolutely, in so many ways, right? And when I'm talking about gendering, of course, it's not merely men versus women, it's also the gendering of work and various other things that are going on, which are, of course, so nicely talked about in the cyborgian version of post-human subjectivity in some ways, right? And I'm wondering, how is it that one can talk about technology as both empowering and repressive at the same time? Which, it's interesting because in so many ways, the work that I'm doing is a bit of a generational ethnography. I'm looking at people who are 18 to 24 who are being incorporated into work regimes much earlier than they would have otherwise. This did not used to be the case in, say, even perhaps the 90s, although the 90s is when it begins to open out. Around the 80s, part-time work was not such a big deal. So the very coming of the corporation as a space that can bring this whole generation in becomes this strange chimera, right? This kind of new place that people aspire to, but at the same time are not very sure what happens. So to answer it partly anecdotally, when they first started incorporating young people into call centers, they had to go and convince parents to allow them to have people enter the call center. So they do tours for parents and for the workers alike, saying this is a safe place. They no longer do that. But what they invest in right now are shiny new building facades, in order that they look high-tech, in order that they seem as a place where you can escape from the grime and chaos of urban India into a corporate space, where it becomes a parallel community space. And that might be one of the examples in which technology is creating this schizophrenic urban landscape in some ways.
So it seems like this is so new that we don't really know what this generation is going to do once they can take the sleeplessness no longer, or right when they sort of outgrow it. And you certainly hear stories of people giving up their undergraduate degrees or their studies to go and take one of these jobs, right? So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts, speculations on what will happen to these workers once they're finished.
That's true. It's a question I get asked all the time, which is what's going to happen to them. And more often than not, it's from business school professors who want to know, will this business last? But in so many ways, so some of my interviews, I've followed people for about 6 or 7 years now. The turnover in the industry is appalling. It's quoted as 40 to 50%. I know for a fact it's about 120%, which means that you have to hire 20% more than the people you started hiring at the beginning of the year, because that many more people have left from the year before. And this is how the call center works. They work from month to month attrition figures. So it can vary anywhere from between 50 to 120. And the way that I have not been able to track people is there's a lot of horizontal mobility. So people get tired of a process, they take a break, and then they go to other call centers. So they move from insurance to credit card to things like that. I don't know what the trend is going to be as far as people who leave call centers is, because the ones who are between 18 and 20, they do get an undergraduate degree, either long distance or in the colleges. And then they take a break and do an MBA and come to parallel service industries. And increasingly what call centers are doing are providing educational support, which is that you sign a bond with the organization and they will provide for a part-time MBA. And so they will allow for your education so that you can be incorporated back into either the IT or the service economy. But they're also moving from this model of mainly the kind of work that I do, which is voice-based call center work, into data. which is what it's marking is a big class shift in the kind of workers that are entering call centers. So it started with upper middle class and middle class. Now it's moving into lower middle class and non-urban or mufassil or provincial areas. So I see, in some ways it's fascinating, it's also a little scary. The business model keeps adapting to the lack of populations, and it's moving down the class. And I don't know if that signals something. I'd be interested in following that.
Very interesting. It just made me start thinking about some things, your discussion of flexibility and empowerment, et cetera. And I'm wondering if some of the models that you're looking at here might be applied to other types of obvious sleep-deprived occupations. So any performers in India, they only perform at night until the early mornings of the day. So this is not something new for India.
Not sure.
It's just that it's not for people on the other side of the world. Prostitution is also from the evening to the morning. I mean, these are my mother used to interview ladies in Chicago, and they worked nights in the cookie factory, you know. And so this is a total opposite time period that people live. So are those types of, is that type of empowerment something that you would be seeing in these other occupations, and might this be expanded to other areas of, and it's part of what is already present in the entertainment industry in Bombay. So these kids are kind of getting to that level without actually getting into those types of businesses.
Right.
So I just was wondering if you might comment on that.
No, thank you for the question. It's one of the things I think I had to struggle with when starting work, saying, well, so many people work in the night anyway, just because this is taking phone calls, what's the big difference? I think the reason why this got so much publicity was this was middle class to begin with. And the middle class never had to do this. They never had to perform part-time work. They never had to go out at night. Their women never had to go out at night. So this question of respectability, promiscuity, all came into view because these were middle-class women. And that's sort of moving down the chain. So that separates it so many ways from, SEZs or industrial workers. Nobody talks about women working in the night in an industrial area. And the laws did not have to be changed for that. The laws had to be modified in order that women could work in call centers, and hence this transportation experience. So in the States, they modified it to talk about the corporation has to provide transportation to pick up women from home to the workplace. And so the class shift is a big thing. I'd be interested in following what happens when it goes to lower middle class and seeing whether that becomes normalized because nobody is interested in this question of nation state and respectability anymore in some ways.
But aside about gender, I was just thinking, because you talk about it in gender terms and the kind of masculine rite of passage. So sleep deprivation, being awake on demand, continuously being interrupted, sounds like motherhood. So where does that play into this?
It's so many ways, it's what is denied in the service of this, right? And that's what I'm talking about. In some ways, the corporation is a consummate denier of the fact that you have a female body in this workspace and that you have to be able to take that into account. But then it also plays the other card, which is it talks about how in some customer service processes, it's better to have women because people don't abuse or yell at women's voices. Right? So I completely am with you. I think gender is a big invisible factor in the way that the corporation thinks of its workers. But at the same time, it also uses it alternatively, talking about how this industry empowers women. How it provides transportation. Now women can have jobs that they didn't used to. And there's a lot of work on women in call centers in a way that talks about. So I'm completely with you with that question. Okay.
I was just reading the other day that Malaysia sent up its first astronaut in 2007 in preparation for that. He was Muslim, and whole rules had to be given for how this astronaut was going to perform ritual obligations and also fast and such things. Is there anxiousness within the Muslim community in Pune about Muslim youth who are taking these jobs, working night? Is there advice given to them? How are the workers who are Muslim thinking about religious obligations? Or in fact, is there a disproportionately low number of Muslims participating?
The latter. And this is, I do not have the exact numerical data to bear it out, so perhaps you'll have to take what I say with a grain of salt. There are disproportionately lower number of Muslim men and women in the corporations. There were a fair number of them that I could talk about, but certainly you can see very clearly that they're not very present. But I'm not sure if I could link that to the fact of religious ritual or something like that, or the very question of education itself. Or in Pune itself, it could be the regions that I worked in and how ghettoed they are and which areas that you find call centers in. So I don't know how clearly to make a connection with that.
This reminds me a lot of the kind of social mobility that industrial jobs offered, particularly low-caste and untouchable workers in the 1920s and 30s. And by the 1940s and 50s, that social mobility just wasn't there anymore. It wasn't as liberatory as it had been during the 1920s and 30s. I wonder if that same sort of thing could happen where, you know, these jobs now they're kind of this way to rebel and to you know, claim yourself, claim your life as an adult, but then maybe that will break down later on. And of course, I have to ask: Did you ever come across any low caste or untouchable workers? I assume it's just the same situation with Muslim workers. There's so much smaller proportion of them, if any.
I agree completely, and I'm unfortunately, let me take the latter part of the question first, which is I never asked the caste question. Right? It's very difficult to ask the caste question. I can conjecture it from last names and things like that. I do not ask the caste question as a matter of principle. I do not do that. But in so many ways, what was important to me and what came up very obviously was the class question. There's no question of it. These are starting, and this goes from 2001, 2002 onwards. 2003 is when I became acquainted with call center workers. It goes from upper middle class, relatively elite, well-off families, goes to middle class, and then now lower middle class. Right? Essentially, and when I was training, this is what I used to be told by colleagues all the time, which is that, oh, it's so difficult to train them. It's not like they've never learned English in their lives. And clearly, this is a big class marker in so many ways. But the question of social mobility, I'm going to be a little cautious and say I really want to see how this feeds into an expanding middle class, because that's increasingly becoming a very ambiguous, porous category. And so many ways I find questions of service work, comportment, learning of language, how it's expanding into an expanding sector of what middle class counts for. And it's becoming confused. There's no longer a very clear isomorphism between you speak such good English, that's, you know, certain kind of accent, and you're middle class. You can speak very possible English and make a lot of money in certain parts of urban India and be part of this kind of rising middle class consciousness. And that I find very, very interesting to follow up in that way.
The place where I know something similar to this is like old mining towns and company towns and stuff like this, where you have people working all hours of the day. One of the things that comes out of those communities is not only that whole families start to get involved in the process, or in some cases become trapped in that process, but also that you start getting I guess cultural expressions. I think of bluegrass music is what I think of. All these complaints about, you know, working in the cotton mill and working in the mines and stuff like this. And I'm wondering if stuff like that is starting to come out. You know, or do these guys have rock bands where they're complaining about working all night? You know, and, I mean, is that kind of stuff coming out? Okay.
Oh, that's a great question in so many ways. So the first part is, it does not become a family occupation, but it's a huge community of young people, all of who seem to know each other, because they all have this horizontal mobility between call centers. So if you know one,
marrying within?
Hugely, very much so. Very much so, marrying, getting divorced, breaking up. It's a huge hormonal hotbed.
That I figured, actually.
In so many ways, right? So all of this is definitely happening, and they're all moving up. So when they become managers, the only people who can understand their hours are other managers who they get married to and things like that. In terms of what kind of cultural expressions are coming up, I know a lot of them are in bands or play music and things like that. But it's so interesting because they're all sponsored by the corporation. Because they're all like, talk about how the corporation gives them time to do this and how it's so benevolent and how it takes care of them. But I've also noticed an upsurge of popular culture productions around call centers. Films and songs and ideas of a call center subculture. So there are other people talking about it, but there's no clear rebellion yet. And in some ways, I locate this to how much of a floating population it is. It comes and goes at will, and it keeps moving in and out, and it's a big problem for the corporations too.
Two things. First, to follow up on Ken's question, I'm wondering if any comparable studies have been done on call centers in Hyderabad with a Muslim population. And then secondly, you talk about, these are campuses. You call them corporate campuses. Now, some campuses have dormitories, right? No, I'm wondering if there is a move on the part of the corporations to, in fact, create a residential community where, in fact, you can pull a worker out of his bed and put him in front of a computer instead of having to send a cab to
go and pick them
him or
up.
her come. And is this part of the scene or not?
Great. To answer the first question, which is that are there dormitories? No, not for call centers, because apparently the investment is still not worth it. They still have this regular cashier of workers they can pull from at will that they haven't started doing it yet. But I know they're doing it for IT workers. I know Infosys has a big campus in around one of these pictures that I was talking about that looked like prison cells, essentially, for IT workers. And I don't have a picture on me, otherwise I'd show it. It's a beautiful building. It's horribly scary. So they're not doing that just yet. But what they are doing is the idea of slowly farming it out to workers who work from home. And they haven't managed to do it yet, which is provide telephone connections or VPN connections in order that you can have a decentralized system of managing all this work for housewives and retired army personnel. Because they say that this is the category they want to tap into. They're far more reliable and they do much better at being able to deal with customer service demeanor. So they haven't started doing it yet. And I'm sorry, will you tell me your first question again?
The second one was Hyderabad.
Hyderabad, there's only one study which has been done by Carrie Kapoor, who works out of Stanford, but she looks at marriage questions in the call center. There are no comparable studies of how this has affected Muslim populations yet.
You've mentioned this floating population quite a bit, with a huge turnover. But I'm wondering, what I didn't hear in what you were presenting was the ways that this turnover is articulated by those who are working in this job.
Sure.
And what effect does the turnover have on their perceptions? And you mentioned the body thing as maybe part of it, but it seems like that itself, the perception of exploitation, or I mean, was there any kind of effects of this, of knowing that it's probably going to end for most people?
So the perception actually is the other way around. They keep talking about how they can leave anytime they want. It's sort of like this addiction discourse over and over again, which is that I just have to do it for a few months. I can last in it. And then there is also this regret. I know people who've spoken to me 3 years after the job saying, I kept thinking I can leave it at the end of 1 year and I'm still here. So I think the question of feeling exploited comes from thinking that there are no other options. In so many ways, you leave a call center, you're there for 3 months, you get used to the kind of money that it gives you, and you're looking around and there's nothing else. Unless you do an MBA or get higher education, you don't have the possibility of actual upward mobility, although the call center promises it. A lot of call centers are tied to IT outfits, and they say, you know, you take this exam, you do this, and you get what is called an IJT, an internal job transfer. And they're forever looking for IJTs. And a lot of them get in because of this. But the tactics of why and how they join a call center are also so varied. There are many of them that are doing engineering degrees and have failed a couple of exams and are sitting it out for 4 months and want to go to a call center, make some money before they go back. There are a couple who are looking at call centers as a way to get training possibilities. They say that we go there, they'll teach you how to go through an interview, how to speak in English, and then we can go interview elsewhere. So their sense of being in the call center is always temporary, although their tenure might not be so. And that's how they constantly articulate it.
My question is probably unfairly broad, and as I've been listening, just curious, who had this idea? How did this get started in India? And is it happening in other major languages like Spanish and whatever?
General Electric, there was a guy called Raman Roy who started Spectramind. And Spectramind tied up with General Electric, to bring the first ones to Delhi. And this was 99, 2000, around this time. And he said, why don't we look at this as an experiment and think about how it's moving? And this was when it was shrouded in secrecy. Like, people would not talk about it. I learned about it purely covertly because I knew some friends who were going to work at midnight. And I said, what sort of job are you working at? And they'd speak in very, very enunciated, clear accents, and I used to think they were from the Middle East. And this was 99 to about 2001. And then it started expanding on this unbelievable scale, because people realized that this, and somebody quoted this to me, it's not very borne out, that the savings from such kind of movement of work are easily about 40 to 50% of what you might have to spend on it if you're working out of the US. So, and then, since then, there have been movements back and forth because there was political uproar about it, so some work came back over here. Then they started segregating it. So if you want to speak to someone out of the US, you have to pay for it now. Or you have to pay for a specific service that asks for better call centers than the others. So that was one set of how the industry began to sort of stabilize, and that's a little bit of the question. On other things, in the call center that I was working at, there were a couple of American trainers who were teaching people Spanish in order to service Latin America. So I know there is some movement of that, but it's not very popular yet. So in some ways, that's what's going on. But on the whole, it's remained fairly homogeneous, the kind of work that's done.
And then how is it spreading? Like, I seem to remember getting directed to somebody in the Philippines.
The Philippines, Taiwan, Indonesia to a certain extent, and China are major competitors. And people keep talking about how China is going to catch up. They're all permanently worried about it. And they say they've started teaching them English in kindergarten now. Another 20 years, they'll catch up. So there is the discourse constantly about the competition. The other major competition also seems to be South Africa, because it seems to be on a similar time zone. It can service certain countries. So Africa, which is a whole different interesting question altogether as to why work is moving back.
I was just curious, this particular call center tapping pretty locally, or people coming from far away to work here? Who is working here, and maybe even like what makes a good call center worker?
Oh, makes a good
in the eyes of the corporation or in the eyes of the workers themselves.
Right. So in Pune has a big floating population of students. Mm-hmm. So there are a lot of people who are accessed from South India, Western India, who come there for university or college education, who live in dorms, who live away from their parents, who have much more time at their disposal, not so many constraints. So this is a major population that works in Pune-based call centers. Mostly young across India, mostly very, very young people, essentially out of college, that are doing this. What makes a good call center worker? Increasingly, because the demand continues and the supply is not so good, anybody. Anybody who will walk into a call center, can string together a sentence in English, can work in a call center. Essentially.
I'm going to squeeze in one more service question, then I'm going to ask this. I didn't realize, in Southeast Asia, our sense of time goes on to 1:30, and I didn't know that I was being expected to be Mr. Time Police. So I think there was one more question, and can I ask you to be the service call and manage this one question?
Absolutely.
And then we'll disperse, but thank you for that.
Okay, I was just wondering, you talked about attitudes sort of towards sleeplessness, and when you talked about the young men being very proud of themselves for not sleeping. That is a attitude that many undergrads also have, and so there's sort of the same age group. It reminded me very much of myself and my friends. And then I also remembered when I turned 23 and I got a job and I tried to maintain the same kind of sleep schedule, and I was older and it was much more difficult for me. So now, growing up, I've sort of changed my attitudes towards sleeplessness. Did you find that the attitudes people had really depended on age, or was that not something that...
Oh, very much. The attitudes were completely dependent on age in some ways. The second interview that I was referencing was a 27-year-old woman who did not have the same heroic sort of sense of sleep. It was just routine in some. And just sort of to answer that question anecdotally, what the call center does is interesting. It only pulls from a cashier of really young people. When I first applied to work at a call center, I didn't want to be a trainer. I wanted to be an agent taking calls. They said I was too qualified and too old. I was 28 at the time. And they said, there's no way you can do this. Your colleagues will not relate to you, and I don't know how you're going to manage. So do something else. Be a manager. Right, so just a short answer to that question, and I think we're done.
Mathangi, thank you so very, very much.